Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me? My name is David Kang. I manage Japan and Korea research at Bloomberg NEF, and it's a great honor to moderate today's session on reliable renewable energy. We have four esteemed panelists joining us for the discussion today. First, we have Seung-Ho Choe, head of APAC Offshore Wind Development from Pacifico Energy. Next to him, we have Michael Stirling, CEO of Stirling Infrastructure Partners. And then we have David Jones, head of Offshore Development and Korea Country Manager at RWE. And we have Woochong, CEO of Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you could give a warm round of applause for our speakers. Over the past few decades, we've seen the renewable energy industry grow from a very niche segment in the global economy into one of the world's largest industries. Last year, Bloomberg NEF tracked around $680 billion invested in renewable energy projects globally. And 20 years ago, when we first started tracking this number in 2004, we saw just around 30 billion invested in renewable energy projects globally. So the market has grown by 20 times over the past 2 decades. But there are a lot of challenges that lie ahead as well. The current high inflationary environment is making the financing of some of these projects much more challenging. And geopolitical events like wars and trade disputes are increasingly impacting this industry as well. And last but not least, renewable energy must also overcome its technical challenge of reliability, because as we all know, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So in today's panel, we're going to discuss the current status of the renewable energy industry, how far the industry has come, where we are headed, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead, and if time allows, we'll also explore the role that South Korea can play in enabling this transition. We have limited time to go through many different topics, so let's jump straight in. I'd like to start off with a question for Michael. Michael, if you could paint us a high-level picture on where the global renewable energy industry is today, and what are some of the high-level trends that you're seeing in the financing of renewable projects globally?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this session. First of all, I would say there are 2 key drivers that will impact the growth of renewable energy. One is climate change and pressure from the public and the younger generation. The second is policy. And without favorable policies, it's going to be quite hard, I think, to encourage a change of behavior from large corporations, utilities, or really all stakeholders that aren't motivated sufficiently by making change, because change is always complex and expensive. And really what we're seeing is that countries that have favorable regulatory policies, which is a carrot and stick approach, are actually enabling the energy transition to happen more rapidly. Now, the second aspect is financing, and with interest rates going up in the recent period of, let's say, the last 2 years, renewable projects are less attractive for institutional investors to allocate capital to. The returns that you get are not the highest, and fossil fuels provide far higher returns. And further challenges that major oil and gas companies have is that they have quarterly targets that they have to achieve, and renewables doesn't allow them to do that. So there's a number of conflicts that are taking place. But the long-term picture is, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, and I haven't gone to the casino here, but if I was, I would still be betting on renewable energy, because that's the long-term trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You briefly touched on the geopolitical side of things, and I want to ask the next question to Woochong. So these geopolitical events, such as the US presidential election and the war in Europe, is increasingly impacting the renewable energy space. So keen to hear your thoughts on what those impacts have been, and how do you navigate this challenge at the GAPP in the markets that you operate?
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I joined the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet just about 5 weeks ago, after about 30 years of working in the Asian Development Bank. So I come from a banking development space, going into philanthropy. there's a reason for that. That's because not just because I've been in the ADB for so long, precisely because of this geopolitics. It doesn't have an impact, but there are many stakeholders and the players in this space. There are governments, the multinationals, multilaterals, philanthropies, and private sector, and certain regimes could put a bit of a dampener on the pushing of the renewable energy space, but they're not the only player in the space. So I expect, no matter who takes over, it will be very, very important for everyone to push this agenda for renewable energy, especially from the private sector perspective and the philanthropies. And from day one, since it was a long time ago, but also especially since the Paris Agreement, we all knew that the government sector is not going to be able to deliver this. It's got to be the private sector that needs to come in, which means that we need to create the enabling environment for private capital and the technologies to come in to the renewables and climate change in the broader spectrum of things. And I expect that there will be more pressure for entities like the philanthropies to step up and create an enabling environment for renewable energy to prosper in the developing world, especially by providing capacity development, absorptive capacity enhancement, as well as the private capital to flow. So that's one of the reasons why I jumped from multilateral international organization to philanthropies, because there's a tremendous potential to tap the resources and knowledge, and also the political capital that the philanthropies carry, to be able to step up if needed and work together with all the other stakeholders in this group.
I see. Thank you very much. Michael, I was wondering if you want to add a bit more perspective from someone who's actually within the financial industry right now, financing these projects, what some of these impacts have been.
So there's two aspects to your question. The first is from a financing perspective. The amount of capital that is available to be allocated really differs from country to country. It is not a standard kind of approach in which large players want to invest into all geographies. One of the key things that our investors look at is the liquidity of the asset. So if you're allocating large capital pools, you want to be able to cash out and be able to sell it to someone else. So if the economy is a smaller economy where the market is tight and let's say there's only a few kind of state-owned players, or there's only 2 or 3 families operating, let's say, in that smaller market, they're very unlikely to want to go into those markets. The markets that are the most attractive are the larger markets where there's transparency, there is stability of currency, and there is opportunity for growth, and there's a number of players that will cash in and cash out, and there is income that is being generated. And it depends which part of the process you go into a deal. The risk is very different if you go ready to build than if you're operational. And the more sophisticated investors want to go in at ready to build because they make far higher margins. And then you have the institutional investors that are investing your pension funds for the cash flows for 20 years, and they will just go in once it's fully operational and looking just for the cash flow. So they're the key elements I would first of all think about, is which market we're talking about. The second is the currency risk. Currency risk is a big issue for going into emerging markets. So often the PPAs pay in local currency, and the institutional investors want to be paid in hard currency. So that's another risk that needs to be evaluated.
And I want to dive into some specific technologies. David, we met last week in Busan at a wind conference, and you gave an inspiring presentation on how offshore wind could be a game changer in renewable energy. So if you could walk us through that logic a little bit, and then talk about what are some of the critical factors for offshore wind in enabling the transition. Why is offshore wind so important?
Thank you, David. I think we've already heard some some very good insights from both Michael and Woochong on the mobilization of capital and the need for markets and projects to be financially attractive. And I think that is really at the core of what we need to keep in mind when we think about the role that offshore wind can play. I think if we look at particularly for Korea and the targets that have been set by the government, the high-level targets, we have the 10th Basic Plan where there's a goal to achieve 14.3 gigawatts by 2030 with less than 200 megawatts operational. And then we've had the draft of the 11th that's come out with even bigger ambitions. And we're yet to see the detail within that draft, and that will come in due course. But what I expect we will see is an even bigger target for offshore wind development. So in order for offshore wind to play such a key and pivotal role in the energy transition, particularly in Korea, I think there are kind of three key things that we really need. The first is clear, stable regulations that have a long-term view. We've had some announcements recently from the Korean government about a roadmap for the next 2 years, but 2 years is not going to create a multi-billion-dollar market where companies need to invest, capital needs to mobilize, investors, both institutional and utility such as us, have confidence in the revenue streams we are going to gain over a longer term period, and that after one project there will be more. There will be more opportunities. It will be a prosperous industry to be able to invest in longer term. I think those policies also need to have a realistic consideration of the energy trilemma that we're facing, which is the need to decarbonize, the need for security of supply, and also affordability. And I think those are three key factors that need to come into the overall policy making. And then I think we get down to the real nuts and bolts about how we deliver offshore wind projects. And we need to see, while we've got a market where we are today and we've got some longer term targets, what we need to see is what is the plan to get there. And I think we're really missing that. What is the plan for investments in ports? Where will the ports be? How will we build them? What sort of activity are we going to expect at different parts of infrastructure? What's the plan for grid rollout? What sort of level of investment are we going to need? What sort of obligations are we going to put on the state-owned grid operator, KEPCO? Are we going to bring in private industry? Are we going to deregulate parts of it? How are we going to speed that up to keep up to date with those targets? How is the infrastructure, ports, grids, and otherwise going to support this rollout? So I think those are the key things that are needed as we look towards offshore wind in Korea and other markets as one of the big contributors as a technology that can deliver large-scale decarbonized energy.
Thank you very much. I actually have a follow-up question on some of the points that you mentioned, and it's about reliability. It's one of the titles of our session. When we think about integrating more renewable energy into the power mix, reliability is a key issue, especially when you start comparing with existing fossil fuel assets that are generally much more stable in power generation profile. So I'm keen to hear, among some of the renewable assets out there, offshore wind is the one that we're seeing the highest capacity factor, which is like another word for availability. Based on your experience developing and operating many of these projects, how reliable is offshore wind? And if we look into the horizon out to 2050, what kind of advancements that can we expect from this technology going forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. I have the privilege working for a company like RWE for a very long time, of having been involved in many parts of the value chain, and we have been operating offshore wind farms for over 20 years. And I was the general manager of one of those offshore wind farms, the first ones to be built in the UK. It was called North Hoyle off the coast of Wales. And I think I was around for 4 years during that time with that asset, and it was between 15 and 20 years. It's highly reliable offshore wind technology, highly proven. And actually, we had joint ventures with institutional investors, pension funds and other funds as well with these assets. And the predictability and reliability of energy output and returns over a long period is highly predictable. And I think that's why a lot of institutional investors quite like offshore wind, because over the long term, the returns are more predictable than in some cases other investments. So the technology is certainly there. That's on the supply side. But really, I think a lot of questions of reliability really come down on the demand side and really on grid. And that's where the next question is. And what we need to see is an energy mix. And offshore wind will be a part of an overall energy mix. It won't be the only technology. That's not an advisable idea as an energy utility that operates all sorts of energy plant, whether they be from coal, lignite, or we've had a long history in nuclear previously, offshore wind, onshore wind, battery storage. We need to have that energy mix, and we need to see grid technologies and grid enhancing technologies continue to develop to help to deal with the intermittency and the matter of the end consumer and the sort of energy that they receive, and whether that is a stable load to be able to do manufacturing or whatever other business they need. That is something where we need to see further advancements in grid technology, further development of grid technologies, battery energy storage, more flexible generation, and a plan for bringing on board more flexible generation. How we deal with demand response side, energy balancing. The technology of offshore wind is highly reliable and highly dependable, and we know about its intermittency. This is nothing new, but we need to see grid technologies also develop and an overall plan, a strategic plan for a grid system to deliver long-term reliable energy for the end consumer.
Before sort of moving outside of offshore wind, I just want to ask you one more question. We briefly talked about the impact of geopolitical events in the energy sector. And there's rising economic tensions between the US and China around trade disputes, et cetera, et cetera. What's been the impact of on offshore wind projects so far?
I think the impact we can't see the impact immediately. But on paper, I carry a US passport, so I can't be too impartial. But relationship, like any other relationship between the United States and China is complex. Not only geopolitical, also economic issues involved. And I think one of the things we need to consider is why there are tensions, but obviously that's for another political discussion. But as my other panelists have mentioned, the world is going green. Most of the developed countries are transitioning from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy. And that's inevitable. The pressure is there. So it's important when you have initiatives like RE100 that companies need to transition to green energy to compete in the market. And so you need energy security. Now, energy security is a very good term that's becoming very popular. But in order to get energy security, you need to secure supply chain. And as I mentioned before, one of the issues with the rapid development of offshore wind projects in Asia is bottlenecks in the supply chain, including, for example, installation vessels. You can have everything ready, but if you don't have the volume that can attract companies to bring their installation vessel to build those projects for you, it's never going to happen. So supply chain is very important. You need to secure towers, the turbines, etc. And that in itself, when you consider energy security and the need to secure supply chain, you need to secure supply chain partners that are reliable, trustworthy, and friendly. But it's very simple. Reliable, but also politically friendly. Because if at any point in time there's tension between China and the US, and if we start using, for example, I don't know if there are any people from China, no offense, but if there's a serious dispute between US and China, America will not allow Chinese parts to be used. But look at China, and I think fundamentally there's a big rationale for it, because if you look at the solar space, China dominates the solar space. You can't build a economic, commercially feasible project without using Chinese solar panels. You look at offshore wind, 75 gigawatts is the amount of offshore wind that's been installed globally, 75 gigawatts. Of that, almost half been installed in China. China has internal self-sufficiency to build the entire supply chain. They have supply chain partners within China. They can do it all themselves. Now, if China repeats their success in the solar space, in the offshore wind space, I think the global suppliers are going to be in a lot of trouble. So when you have tensions with U.S. and China, I know I'm going long, so you don't have to ask me more questions. But when the tension between U.S. and China increases, I think it's a huge opportunity for Korea. Recently we had the U.S., Korea, Japan alliance, confirmation of that alliance. That is going to seep into commercial. I've spoken to a number of high officials, the U.S. Government, and they want to take the trilateral partnership will go beyond just political, military, strategic partnership. It'll go to commercial partnership. And one of the areas, and because it's about energy security, one of the things you don't want to do is have that supply chain be controlled and dominated by a potential adversary. Too long?
No, that was perfect. And it's interesting you mentioned China. So we do a lot of modeling at BNEF, and whichever sector that we model, we have this running joke within China is half of everything. So whether you look at electric vehicles, solar, wind, when you model long term and currently as well, China does account for half of everything. Last year, China added more solar capacity than all of the rest of the world combined. And that really speaks to the scale of this market and the importance of working with China and also leveraging the capacity that we have in China to accelerate the transition in the rest of the world. You did give a long answer, but I'll just ask you one more before we move on. You oversee the Asia Pacific region for offshore wind, and if you look at the historical developments, with the exception of China, Europe and America really have been the leading markets in terms of installation. But going forward, we do see a lot more opportunity in APAC. So outside of China, if you can pick 3 markets, maybe in the order of importance in your view, that the people in the audience should look out for. And what are some of the critical elements for offshore wind in those markets in your view?
Obviously, to me, the most important market in the world is Korea. And number 2, I would say we also have operations in Japan, so Japan will be number 2. And number 3 would be Vietnam. Now, I had other thoughts, but we have an operation in Vietnam, so I think for internal stakeholder purposes and management, I would say probably Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Now, obviously, the offshore wind industry started in Europe. I think the oldest offshore wind facility, farm, is about 30 years old. And so they've had a long start. And why is Korea, in Japan, and even Vietnam, why is offshore wind very important? Fundamentally, to my view, is the transition to green energy. And renewable energy and initiatives like RE100 will become trade barriers. I think most people or a lot of people don't really appreciate the fact what the powers that be in Europe and West have done in terms of mapping a playing field and setting the rules where everyone else has to follow. And unfortunately, even with China, Korea, Japan, East Asia, some of the most powerful economies in the world, or the leading export nations in the world, we still don't control the global narrative. That's unfortunate. And I hope when my children grow up, they do. We do control it, but we don't. So though the rules have been set, and I honestly believe every convention or speech I make, I always say RE100 is a trade barrier. It will be a trade barrier if Korea and Japan and Vietnam do not wake up and push offshore wind and get it developed as soon as possible 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, it doesn't matter whether Korean companies build the best ships in the world, the best steel, smartphones. You're never going to be able to sell it when they, choke you with the RE100. Now, I don't have an issue with the RE100. That's why Korea and Japan and Vietnam will be the up-and-coming exporter. I think once there's awareness, there's going to be tremendous urgency to do it. And look at 3 countries. You can only speak for Korea, but I think for the most part, Japan is the same. Supply chain. Korea has one of the world's strongest supply chain sector, where Korean companies are one of the leading suppliers of towers, foundations, be it jackets or monopile, cables, offshore wind, offshore substation. Korean construction companies can build all that. We have a skilled labor force. We have a manufacturing sector that's second to none. We have, again, offshore construction, and we have money. Now, of course, there are challenges. We have grid issues. Korean developers have to do everything by themselves. We have to go meet the fishermen. All the stakeholder management has to be done by ourselves. But we have the tools to get it done. And I think that's why all of the international players, including RW, is in Korea, because this is a market. The future for APAC, Korea, Japan. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, you did. We often hear about Korea, Japan, Taiwan, sort of that triangle, but it's interesting to hear Vietnam coming into the mix.
Well, we have an office in Vietnam,
Yeah,
so it's
fair enough.
internal promotion. But I think one of the reasons why it was number 3. If we had 4 offices, if we had 2 offices, I may have something. But I think one of the issues, in my personal view, because before I was I was country manager for another company that I won't mention. We had operations in Taiwan, and Taiwan is becoming like it was a hot place for offshore wind, but now it's kind of calming down. And interestingly, one of the things they recently they're pushing for is local content. But I don't know. I think most of you are too young. In my generation, back in the 80s, when I was in college or high school, there was talk in the world about the 4 tigers or the 4 dragons. It was Korea, it was Taiwan, it was Singapore, it was Hong Kong. Of the 4, the only country that has gone big, we love building big things. We build ships, we get shipping contracts without a shipyard. Nobody can do that. We have ships, we have steel, we have cars, and everything else we make, right? Taiwan, on the other hand, took the small, mid-sized business route. But as I said, if you look at the local content requirements about using local steel, you got to play to your strength. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been a certain level of restraint. I don't know if restraint, I can't find a word, but a certain level of stepping back from that market. That's why I still think Vietnam is probably a more potential market than Taiwan.
Thank you very much. So we talked a lot about offshore wind, and I'd like to zoom out a little bit and think about the impact of the energy transition on our everyday lives. So for many countries, when they think about energy policy, it's very closely linked to their industrial strategy. And that's why I think it's very important to think about the impact of the energy transition on jobs and what additional jobs that this can create. So I have a question for Woochong, and Michael, if you want to chime in as well. In your view, is the transition from fossil fuel to clean energy, including renewable energy, actually creating more jobs on a net basis? And what are some of the delicate balancing acts that countries and government need to consider as they navigate this transition?
Thank you. First of all, sitting here listening, I'm learning a lot, including the fact that Mr. Choe is not nervous at all, even though he's wearing a suit and being asked the last question. But seriously, it's very stimulating to learn about the topics here. So, from the space that I work in, of course, Korea is very important, but we have to worry about everybody moving together in the global scene. And there's still 2-3 billion people living in poverty out there in the world. So we have to make sure that we provide access to energy for people, so that people don't go and cut trees and burn fossil fuels or use. When I first went to the Philippines to work for the ADB in the 90s, they had 8-hour blackouts every day, which is debilitating for the economy. And Korean company came and solved the problem within 2-3 years, when they thought it's going to take them 10 years to do so, with coal-fired power plants. Very expensive, but at least give electricity, right, at the time. So that's what people cared about. But now they're realizing that that's not going to be sustainable in the long term. So, they are launching into, various initiatives so that they can decarbonize, including shutting down some of the coal plants early. So those are some of the positive movements, and providing access to jobs and providing productive use of energy are the two things that we as in Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet are targeting. So overall, GEAP, what we call a short term for GEAP, is to provide 1 billion people access to clean energy, provide 150 million jobs, green jobs that's associated to the transition, and averting 4 billion tons of CO2 as not just GEAP ourselves, as an alliance. Because we have so many players in this world that are moving in the same direction, and we want to make sure that we're running out of time. This is not about competition or between any countries or any technology, any companies. It's a race between time and technology deployment in the region or in the world. So the key is actually education at all levels, whether it's addressing demand side or supply side. Young people have to start to learn about these things, and they are doing it. And in fact, my kids, when they're in primary school, they knew more about renewable energy and energy efficiency than most adults. Maybe because they don't have to worry about the energy security at the time. But because of the energy development, the costs are coming down. But the reliability is an issue also, right? So we'll talk about maybe in the next round is about battery storage, which is a key to providing stability, especially on the distributed energy efficiency, distributed renewable energy in the off-grid or mini-grid scene. So in terms of transitioning, there are many initiatives out there, which is supported by the G7 governments. And one of them is called the JETP, Just Energy Transition Platform, which started in South Africa and then in Indonesia and in Vietnam now. So there's some overlap with some of the colleagues here. And the idea is to channel huge amounts of money to these countries so that the partners can work together to make sure that we reduce the CO2 by deploying more renewable energy, but also caring about the policies that are needed so that people can transition from fossil fuel to the new. So when you start deploying new technologies, there are people who are needed in that space to be able to maintain throughout the life of the projects. And also when we deploy, for example, solar projects in the agriculture sector, it opens up all sorts of job opportunities and livelihood and rising the income level. So we want to make sure that everybody's moving in concert towards the sustainability in the long run, so that we can achieve those, the sustainable SD 2030 targets. And we only have 6 years to go, and we're running out of time.
Thank you very much. Michael, is there anything you want to add in terms of the job creation opportunity and around like industrial strategy as different countries approach the transition?
So what I would say is that innovation is key. And there are two types of governments. One is that looks backwards, and there's those that look forward. And the ones that look forward and are actually going to be the innovators are the ones that actually will achieve the competitive advantage. And there are huge opportunities in developing new technologies and proving them. And this should be done through the best universities, through cooperations with large corporations, to actually identify the most efficient types of technologies. Batteries is key, which has been alluded to. There's green hydrogen, which we haven't spoken about yet. There's SAF fuels, sustainable aircraft fuels. There's all different types of innovations. The challenge that we have, and one of the things that really disappoints me, is this attitude globally where we have two conflicting regions, OECD and non-OECD countries, the global south, in constant conflict with each other, which actually creates huge inefficiencies for mankind and actually generates more problems than we can solve if we collaborated. So maybe I'm a fantasist in that way. But raw materials, most of the key raw materials is actually owned by China. When we look at our analysis, you look at like the materials that you need for batteries. The Chinese are ahead of that, control most of that globally. Uranium for nuclear power, they control most of that. So China will always have a competitive advantage if it controls the raw materials. And it has a significant advantage because China has a long-term view, a long-term global strategic view. It's not a government that lasts for 4 to 7 years. It looks at the world over 100 years. And it identifies opportunities in markets where it can add value. It's willing to take risk that European, US companies don't typically take. And then it generates itself as an integral part of those countries. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that because European and US companies or OECD countries could also do that if they choose to do so. There's two different conflicting approaches. And then what happens is, rather than us all working collectively towards energy efficiency and actually working for the best of all, what actually develops is a game of chess between two regions, the global south and the OECD. And it becomes a huge mess. And that's the reality of where we're at. And in the short term, I can't see things getting any better. So you have countries that need to focus on technology, but if you don't have the raw materials at a sufficiently low price, you're going to have more problems with the value chain, and pricing isn't competitive. And as a result of that, people will tend to go towards fossil fuels. So I think it is a complex matrix. We've got COP29 happening again this year. And I really believe personally that as the global climate change emergency becomes more of a challenge for us, for humanity, it's only at that point that I would see more disentangling happening because there will be no alternative for all of us. But until we get to that point, I think we're going to have more of the same, unfortunately. So that's my personal view.
That concludes our session. Please give a warm round of applause to our panelists. And thank you very much for joining us today.